Hey guys, tonight we will not just recount history, we will confront its ultimate savagery, drawn from one of the bloodiest reigns in English history. Let us step back to the 16th century, where King Henry VIII ruled with steel and blood, transforming Smithfield into a public slaughterhouse for tens of thousands of lives. But among the countless deaths, from hanging, drawing, to quartering, there was one sentence that crushed all standards of cruelty. A horrifying execution that took place on the 5th of April, 1531, which left the entire crowd trembling and nauseous. That was the moment Richard Roose, a cook accused of poisoning, had to pay the price through the method of boiling alive. Imagine, a massive cauldron filled with boiling water placed right at the burial site of those who had been buried alive. A ritual of execution so barbaric that it was created to become a horrifying curse. This was not merely a murder, this was a disgusting warning from the throne, and we need to explore. Was Roose simply a pawn used by King Henry VIII to cover up a dark political conspiracy involving the church and the crown? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we are about to begin this gruesome journey, tell me, where in the world are you, and what time is it on your clock? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Henry VIII's reign is often painted in the darkest shades. Years of war, political terror, and punishment so brutal that people of the Tudor age came to accept horror as part of daily life. Chroniclers would later estimate that across his time on the throne, around 70,000 souls were executed, a number so vast it almost stops meaning anything, like trying to count the stars on a cloudy night. Yet behind that number are bodies, faces, names. Men and women who walked to the scaffold while crowds gathered, not in shock, but in a kind of grim habit. Executions were public lessons. They unfolded before hundreds, sometimes thousands of onlookers, who pressed together in the cold air, breathing in smoke, sweat, and the metallic smell of fear. People did not come only to watch. They came to remember. Each hanging, each burning, each swinging axe was a message written in blood about the absolute power of the king. Henry VIII did not merely rule, he reminded his subjects, again and again, that their lives were his to take. Within that already chilling landscape, one particular day rose above the rest, like a nightmare that refused to fade. On the 5th of April, in the year 1531, the people of London woke to whispers that something different, something worse than usual, was going to happen at Smithfield. Smithfield was already a place of dread, a field of fire and ash, where heretics had been burned and where cries of agony had soaked into the soil. But on this day, the crowd would not come to see a man hanged or burned. They would come to see a human being boiled alive in a great iron cauldron. The idea itself felt almost unreal. To treat a living person as if he were a piece of meat to be cooked, even for people used to severed heads and charred bodies, seemed to cross an invisible line. Yet Henry VIII, when he wished to punish or to send a political signal, did not recognize such lines. Mercy was not part of the message he wanted to send. And so, as dawn crept over London's rooftops, a huge iron pot was dragged out into the open space at Smithfield and set upon a blazing fire. It was placed deliberately where so many had already met their end, as if the ground itself were being asked to witness one more cruelty. The flames licked the underside of the cauldron, water inside beginning to shudder and tremble, sending up curls of steam that blurred the edges of the watching world. People arrived in waves, wrapping their cloaks tighter, whispering, staring at the strange, monstrous object that waited for its victim. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply watched, silent, unsure whether curiosity or dread was stronger in their chests. The man who would be brought there was not a prince, not a rebel leader, not a knight in shining armor. His name was Richard Roose. He was an ordinary man, a servant, a cook. No titles, no lands, no banners bearing his sigil. He worked in the kitchens, in the heat and grease and smoke, where nobody of importance ever bothered to look. Yet on this day, the eyes of an entire city seemed to focus on him, because the charge laid upon his shoulders was heavy enough to shake the whole kingdom. He was accused of poisoning one of the most powerful bishops in England. In a land already trembling with religious tension, where whispers of reform and defiance were beginning to creep into sermons and taverns, the idea of a bishop being poisoned felt like more than a crime. It felt like a sign, an omen, or an opportunity. Henry VIII, already suspicious of anyone who stood in the way of his desire to set aside Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, seized on the case with a fierce, almost personal intensity. A plot against a great churchman could be a plot against the stability of the realm, or it could be used as a warning to all who dared resist the king's will. For Henry, there was no difference. Fear was a useful tool, and he knew how to wield it. So, as the fire roared under the cauldron, the people did not gather at Smithfield merely to see a man die. They came to witness a new chapter in Tudor brutality being written before their eyes. The crowd thickened until there was barely room to move. Even pregnant women, drawn by morbid curiosity or by the insistence of husbands and neighbours, stood in the press of bodies, their hands resting anxiously on the swell of their bellies. Soon Richard Roose would be led out to the waiting pot, to the boiling water that churned and spat like something alive. The air was heavy, as if the whole city were holding its breath. This was not just another execution. It was a spectacle of terror, designed to sink deep into memory, to haunt dreams, to remind every servant and every subject what could happen if they were ever thought to have crossed the king. And in that thick, smoky air, as the voices hushed and the chains began to rattle, the tragedy of Richard Roose truly began. A cook about to be thrown into a cauldron, like the very food he had spent his life preparing. In the noble households of England during the reign of Henry VIII, nothing inspired more fear than the quiet, creeping possibility of poison. Warfare was loud, visible, and heroic. Poison was silent, invisible, and deeply personal. It slipped into goblets, seeped into steaming bowls, and turned the warmth of a shared meal into a whispered death sentence. Among courtiers and nobles, every bite could be a gamble, every sip a moment of hesitation. In such a world, the cook, a mere servant in the hierarchy of the household, held a position that was both necessary and perilous. He worked behind the scenes, unseen yet essential, and his hands touched the very sustenance of the powerful. It was a profession that could lift a man through trust or destroy him through suspicion. It was within this climate of tension and distrust that John Fisher, one of the greatest Catholic scholars in all of Europe, sat down to dine on the 18th day of February in the year 1531. Fisher was not just a learned clergyman. He was a man whose loyalty to the old faith placed him in direct conflict with the shifting tides of Henry VIII's reign. Yet on that winter day he was simply gathering with his advisers and attendants inside his residence at Lambeth Marsh. No one present could have imagined that the meal would become the centre of a national scandal. But according to the official Act of Parliament later passed, Richard Roose, also known as Richard Cook, was accused of slipping poison into a vessel of yeast used for making pottage, a staple stew. What followed was swift and devastating. 2 people died: Bennet Kirwan, a gentleman in Fisher's household, and Alice Trippitt, a poor widow who had come seeking charity and accepted a serving of the meal. Yet the darkest twist of the event was not the tragedy of the dead, but the inexplicable fact that Bishop Fisher himself, supposedly the intended target, was entirely unharmed. He had abstained from eating that day, perhaps due to fasting. That single detail carved a deep line of suspicion into the case. If Fisher was indeed the target, why had he alone avoided the poisoned dish? And if he was not the target, then why had 2 unlikely individuals, the gentleman and the widow, been the ones to perish? The mystery thickened as more details emerged. Not just 2, but 17 additional diners fell violently ill after consuming the same food. Many of them were the poor whom Fisher regularly sheltered and fed. Overnight, the bishop's reputation, built on charity and learning, teetered on the brink of destruction. Whispers circulated that he had, intentionally or not, caused the suffering of the very people he sought to protect. And in the Tudor world, where political enemies waited like wolves for a moment of weakness, such a stain on Fisher's name was more dangerous than poison itself. As panic surged, Richard Fisher, the bishop's brother, immediately pursued Richard Roose. But Roose fled the palace before he could be caught. His flight, whether born of guilt or terror, only deepened the cloud of doubt. He did not escape far. Soon he was captured and dragged into the grim stone corridors of the Tower of London, where those suspected of treason or conspiracy were interrogated without mercy. Inside those walls, Under dim torchlight and the looming threat of torture, even the strongest men confessed to things they had never done. Outside the tower, rumours swirled like winter wind across London. Some whispered that this was the work of Protestant reformers, seeking to eliminate one of England's staunchest Catholic defenders. Others murmured that Henry VIII himself might be behind the scheme, eager to weaken Fisher, who openly opposed the king's bid to divorce Catherine of Aragon and wed Anne Boleyn. Fisher had stood firmly with Catherine, defying Henry's ambitions and challenging his growing authority over the church. In such a climate, any misfortune that befell the bishop seemed conveniently timed. But while nobles, ambassadors, and clergy traded suspicions in hushed tones, one man bore the immediate and irreversible cost. Richard Roose, a cook of no renown, no influence, and no power. Whether guilty or merely a pawn in a larger struggle, he had already been swept into the heart of a storm far greater than anything his simple life had prepared him for. And in the ruthless machinery of Tudor politics, the smallest cog was often the first to be crushed. The Tower of London was never a place where a man could cling to his sense of innocence. It was a fortress that swallowed hope, a stone labyrinth where screams dissolved into damp walls, and where even the bravest felt their resolve loosen at the first groan of iron. Once a person crossed its threshold, truth became fragile, and pain became the language through which confessions were carved. For Richard Roose, a cook who had spent his life beside kettles and hearths, the Tower was a world entirely foreign one, made not of fire for cooking, but of fire for breaking the spirit. He was strapped to the rack, the most feared device in England. His wrists and ankles were secured to ropes wound around spools. Then came the turning. Slow at first, like a door creaking open, then tighter, sharper. Every rotation pulled his limbs farther apart, stretching tendon, tearing muscle, bending bone. Each click of the mechanism was like the ticking of a clock, counting down to the moment his joints would burst. Under such agony, even the strongest minds would fracture. It was beneath this crushing pain that Roose confessed. He said he had indeed dropped a white powder into the batch of yeast used for the pottage, but he insisted it was nothing more than a laxative, a foolish jest, meant to provoke discomfort, not death. He claimed he had no accomplices, no secret motives, no deeper plot. He offered no names because, he said, there were none to give. Yet his words only deepened the fog of suspicion hanging over London. How could a mere laxative kill 2 people, Bennet Kirwin and Alice Trippitt, and leave 17 others violently ill? Could such devastation come from a simple kitchen prank? Or was Roose lying to protect someone else? Or was someone else using Richard Roose as a convenient scapegoat? Outside the Tower, rumours multiplied like shadows at dusk. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador representing the Holy Roman Emperor, wrote in his dispatches that he believed the king himself, Henry VIII, and perhaps members of Anne Boleyn's family, had orchestrated the poisoning. John Fisher, after all, was one of the loudest and most respected defenders of Catherine of Aragon, and by extension a thorn in the side of both Henry and Anne. Chapuis even claimed that Anne had at one point written letters expressing her desire for Fisher's death. Whether Chapuis exaggerated or not, his words reflected the sense of unease gripping the court. Something about the case felt too convenient, too timely. Fisher was a major obstacle in Henry's attempt to secure an annulment and reshape the English church, and now a poisoning directed at his household had fallen neatly into the king's hands. Yet no matter how many rumours swirled, the cruelest reality remained stark and simple. Richard Roose would never stand before a judge or jury. His fate was sealed not by evidence, not by testimony, but by royal decree. There would be no trial, no defence, no chance for him to speak openly beyond the tortured cries extracted from him on the rack. On the 28th day of February, in the year 1531, Henry VIII appeared before Parliament and proclaimed that the poisoning constituted an act of treason. In a single speech, he expanded the legal definition of treason to include murder by poison, a shift so abrupt and so targeted that everyone understood exactly who the new law was meant for. From that moment, Roose's death became inevitable. No plea could save him. No argument could soften the king's will. The law had been reshaped like molten metal, forged into a weapon pointed directly at one man, a cook, with no power, no allies, and no voice. But Henry did not stop there. He decreed that treason committed through poisoning would be punished not by hanging, nor beheading, nor burning, but by boiling alive. This was not an ancient custom revived. It was a newly created sentence, crafted specifically for Roose, a punishment engineered as both retribution and spectacle. A punishment meant to terrify. Thus, by royal command, a new and terrible chapter in English execution was written, not because the nation demanded it, not because the courts required it, but because one king decided that a single cook would die in the most horrifying way imaginable. The new law had existed for barely 6 weeks when Richard Roose was taken from the damp stone corridors of the Tower and led towards Smithfield, a place already soaked in the memory of countless Tudor deaths. But even in a century accustomed to severed heads and burning stakes, nothing prepared the people for what was about to unfold. There would be no hanging, no swift beheading, no flames consuming a bound figure. Instead, the sentence was something far more primitive and horrifying. A man would be boiled alive, as if he were nothing more than an ingredient tossed into the pot of fate. From the earliest glimmer of dawn on the 5th day of April in the year 1531, London stirred with anticipation and dread. The air was cold, the sky pale, and yet crowds poured through the streets towards Smithfield. Some walked with grim fascination, murmuring that they wished to see hell brought to earth. Others came only because they could not believe their king would truly perform such a monstrous act. But whether driven by disbelief, fear, or morbid curiosity, the people came. And Smithfield, long a theatre of public suffering, filled rapidly with men, women, and even trembling children pressed against their mothers' skirts. In the centre of the square, a massive iron cauldron squatted over crackling flames. As the fire roared beneath it, steam curled upward in ghostly ribbons. The water inside writhed and rolled, bubbling as though some trapped creature thrashed within. Each hiss and spit of boiling liquid echoed through the crowd like the growl of a metal beast awakening. People stepped back from the heat, their faces reddening as they stared at the monstrous vessel where a man would soon be submerged alive. When Richard Roose was dragged forward, iron chains clinking around his limbs, he looked nothing like a threat to the realm. He was not a rebel leader, nor a noble traitor. He had no army nor influence, only the rough hands of a cook, accustomed to chopping boards and simmering pots. Yet on this day he was bound in a metal frame shaped like a cage, a contraption designed to lower and lift him into the boiling water like a piece of meat being tested for doneness. He could not yet know that his execution would not be a single plunge but a slow, repeated torture. He would be dipped multiple times, long enough for flesh to loosen from bone, then raised again for the crowd to witness the agony etched across his face. No chronicle records Roose's final words. Only the echoes of what followed remain, screams that tore through Smithfield like the cry of a wounded animal, and the panicked sobs of pregnant women carried away half fainting, unable to bear the sight. The brutal truth was that Roose was not simply being executed, he was being displayed, turned into an emblem of terror. When Richard Roose was dragged forward, iron chains clinking around his limbs, he looked nothing like a threat to the realm. He was not a rebel leader, nor a noble traitor. He had no army nor influence, only the rough hands of a cook, accustomed to chopping boards and simmering pots. Yet on this day he was bound in a metal frame shaped like a cage, a contraption designed to lower and lift him into the boiling water like a piece of meat being tested for doneness. He could not yet know that his execution would not be a single plunge but a slow, repeated torture. He would be dipped multiple times, long enough for flesh to loosen from bone, then raised again for the crowd to witness the agony etched across his face. No chronicle records Roose's final words. His body became a living proclamation from Henry VIII to the kingdom, that poisoners, dissenters, and anyone who dared resist the king's will would face not justice but devastation. For cooks, it was a terrifying warning those who worked closest to the food of the great were always under suspicion. And for Bishop John Fisher, whether intended or not, the message hung in the air like rising steam. The king's vengeance was creative, merciless, and absolute. The sound, they said, clung to the air long after the steam faded. Some women in the crowd, especially those who were pregnant, collapsed where they stood, overcome by nausea and terror. They had to be carried away, pale and trembling, unable to continue watching. But there were others, hardened by the brutal entertainments of the age, who stared on with an eerie calm. They had seen beheadings at Tower Hill, hangings at Tyburn, burnings at Smithfield. According to the Chronicle of the Grey Friars, Richard Roose was lowered into the boiling cauldron 3 times before death finally claimed him. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate immersions, each one dragging his consciousness to the very edge of human endurance. The chronicler describes how he screamed with such violence that his cries carried beyond Smithfield, echoing down the narrow Tudor streets like an animal being slaughtered. The executioners waited just long enough for the crowd to witness the horror, then dipped him a second time, holding him there until his screams thinned into hoarse, broken gasps. The third immersion was the last. Whether he was conscious by then, no one truly knows. The chronicles do not describe his final expression, only that when he was lifted out the final time, he no longer moved. Yet even they, accustomed to the theatre of death, felt their stomachs twist, because this was different. This was suffering drawn out, deliberate, and intimate. When Roose was first lowered into the churning water, the boiling liquid erupted into froth, and the smell of scalding flesh spread through the square. It is said that his skin may have begun to separate almost instantly. Then he was raised again, sputtering, howling, his body shaking violently in the iron frame. It was a twisted symbolism, and one that seemed fitting to the king's grim sense of theatrical justice. Yet others believed there was something far more calculating behind the spectacle. A public trial would have required evidence, witnesses, arguments. Roose, under oath and with a chance to speak, might have uttered names of conspirators, names of political enemies, names of those Henry did not wish to be associated with. By denying him a trial and replacing it with an act of pure terror, Henry ensured silence. Roose died without ever revealing whether he had acted alone or under orders, and irony hung thick in the air. The man who was believed to be the true target of the alleged poisoning Bishop John Fisher would only a few years later fall beneath Henry's axe. Fisher, one of the greatest Catholic minds of his time, refused to acknowledge Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. For this defiance, he too met a violent end. Henry changed laws, expanded the definition of treason, and invented a new form of execution, all to kill a single cook. Yet the bishop whose death might have been the purpose of the alleged plot eventually died by Henry's command anyway. Richard Roose's life ended in a cauldron, extinguished by 3 immersions into boiling water. But the truth surrounding the poisoning, the true motive, the possible conspirators, the reason Henry chose a punishment so grotesque remains clouded even today. Like steam rising from the cauldron, the facts drifted upward, curled away, and disappeared into the cold April air, leaving behind only unanswered questions and the haunted memory of a man boiled alive before the eyes of London. The saddest truth in the case of Richard Roose is that although his screams echoed through the streets of Smithfield, the man himself slipped almost entirely out of history's grasp. What survived were the accusations, the sentence, the method of death, cold facts, written by others. But Roose the person, Roose the worker, Roose the human being he is a shadow, barely outlined in the surviving records. And yet, if one gathers the few fragments that remain and places them gently together, a very different picture emerges from the one the Tudor government wanted the world to see. Roose was nothing more than a hired cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher, a respected Catholic scholar and one of the most learned men in Europe. The life of a Tudor cook was not enviable. It was hot, exhausting, messy work, performed in smoky kitchens with poor ventilation, aching backs, and endless demands. Cooks rose before dawn and worked until long after dark, producing food for dozens of mouths every day. They stood on their feet for hours, their hands hardened by heat and knives, yet they remained among the lowest-ranked servants, the servants of the servants, as some would have said. And despite this immense responsibility, preparing food that could sustain or sicken cooks were rarely respected. They were blamed when dishes failed, punished when ingredients spoiled, and distrusted because their role placed them close to the meals of powerful men. But no surviving record shows that Roose had any grievance, any feud, any motive at all to kill. No evidence of hatred, no proof of financial gain, no whisper of involvement in political conspiracy. Under torture, Roose said the white powder he used was a laxative, a common folk prank among servants, harmless in intention, stupid in execution, and certainly never meant to kill. Servants in Tudor kitchens often teased one another with such mixtures, believing them to be irritating but not lethal. If Roose spoke the truth, then the entire catastrophe may have sprung from one foolish joke, tossed casually into the bubbling yeast without malice. But Roose's timing could not have been worse. England in the year 1531 was a nation trembling under the weight of religious conflict. King Henry VIII was locked in a fierce struggle to free himself from Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry Anne Boleyn, and the country was split between loyalty to the old Catholic faith and the king's growing defiance of Rome. In this atmosphere, every incident, no matter how small, could ignite political fire. So a single joke in a dirty kitchen quickly transformed, through rumour and fear, into a full-fledged plot to poison the Catholic elite. The deaths of Bennet Cohen and Alice Trippitt, and the violent illness of 17 others, became evidence of treachery. And Roose, who likely understood nothing of court politics, was swept into a storm far beyond his comprehension. He did not know that John Fisher, his employer, was one of the loudest voices opposing Henry's annulment. He did not know that Fisher's stance placed him in direct conflict with the king and with Anne Boleyn's rising faction. He did not know that any misfortune falling upon Fisher's household would instantly be interpreted through a political lens. He was, in truth, a leaf caught in a hurricane, tossed helplessly into the machinery of Tudor power. Looking back, historians do not see the portrait of a calculating poisoner. They see the tragedy of a man crushed beneath circumstances far larger than he was. Richard Roose's agony belonged not only to him, but to all the small, powerless people, living in an age where a king's word outweighed evidence, reason, and justice. His final screams were not merely the sound of one man dying. They were the sound of countless ordinary lives caught between royal ambition and religious upheaval, lives that could be extinguished with the stroke of a pen or the tightening of a chain. In that sense, Roose's death tells us as much about Tudor England as it does about the man himself. And it reminds us that in times of great political turmoil, it is often the smallest, quietest people who suffer the loudest, most unforgettable fates. The case of Richard Roose cannot be separated from the dark political weather of the year 1531, a time when England trembled under the weight of a royal marriage crisis that threatened to reshape the entire kingdom. Henry VIII, after more than 20 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, found himself desperate for an annulment. He wanted freedom. Freedom to marry Anne Boleyn, the woman who had captured not only his heart but his political imagination. Yet the Pope refused his request, and Europe watched as Henry struggled, increasingly frustrated, against the immovable barrier of Roman authority. Standing firmly on the opposite side of this struggle was Bishop John Fisher, one of the most brilliant Catholic minds in Europe. Fisher was not merely a churchman of high rank. He was a scholar whose opinions carried weight across the continent. He openly defended Catherine of Aragon, denounced the king's efforts to dissolve the marriage, and insisted that only the Pope held the ultimate authority in such matters. Henry resented him. Anne Boleyn loathed him, and both saw Fisher as an obstacle that had to be removed or, at the very least, discredited. It is within this tense, shifting atmosphere that the poisoning occurred inside Fisher's own household. On the 18th of February in the year 1531, 2 people died. 17 were violently sickened. And Fisher, the man who should have been the target, somehow escaped harm entirely. To anyone living in that climate of political and religious suspicion, the incident could not be dismissed as coincidence. It was immediately interpreted as a religious and political act, a strike against a Catholic champion, a blow delivered at a moment when Henry's frustration with the church was boiling over. Even before Roose's confession under torture, the poisoning had already been swept into the political currents of the time, currents strong enough to drown any ordinary man. In the diplomatic dispatches of the era, Eustace Chapuis, ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, did not hesitate in placing blame. He suggested that Henry VIII and members of Anne Boleyn's family were the true architects behind the poisoning. According to Chapuis, Anne herself had once said that she wished Fisher dead, though his reports often reflected his loyalty to Catherine and his hostility toward Anne. Still, such accusations surrounded the event with an air of calculation, of conspiracy, of something deliberately orchestrated rather than accidental. But from the perspective of the Tudor government, Richard Roose was the perfect sacrificial figure. He had no connections worth protecting, no influence worth fearing, no status that would complicate his condemnation. A servant's life was expendable, a small price to pay for political convenience. And if Roose were permitted to stand trial, to speak with clarity rather than under duress. He might perhaps even unintentionally say something that implicated someone far more significant. So Henry chose the simplest path. He changed the definition of treason. He personally announced Roose's guilt before Parliament. He denied him a trial, denied him a jury, denied him a voice, and he ordered his immediate execution. It was not the first time Henry had reshaped English law to eliminate an inconvenient figure, and it would certainly not be the last. The Tudor era repeatedly demonstrated the king's ability to twist statutes like heated metal, hammering them into whatever form suited his purpose. But the case of Roose was different in one chilling respect. The method of punishment had never existed before. Roose was to be boiled alive, a spectacle so gruesome that it seared itself into London's memory. Not because the crime demanded such horror, there had been many poisonings before, punished by hanging or burning, but because the political climate demanded a punishment that would terrify, a punishment that would silence gossip, a punishment that would warn all factions, Catholic or Protestant, noble or servant, that the king's wrath could invent new forms of death whenever he pleased. And so Richard Roose, a cook with no power of his own, became yet another casualty of a reign in which everything, even the simplest joke, the smallest accident, the faintest suspicion could be turned into a weapon. A pawn caught between the ambitions of a king, the defiance of a bishop, and the rising influence of a future queen, he was swept away by forces he could never hope to understand. In the end, Roose did not die because of what he did. He died because of when he lived. And because in Henry's England, timing could kill a man just as surely as poison. To understand why the poisoning shook England so violently, one must look closely at the central figure whom Richard Roose was accused of targeting, Bishop John Fisher. In many ways, Fisher was unlike any other churchman in England during that turbulent era. He was renowned for his brilliant mind, for his unwavering discipline, and for his uncompromising devotion to the Catholic faith. He had earned the admiration of great scholars such as Desiderius Erasmus, who praised him as one of the finest spiritual intellects of Europe. But those same virtues, his integrity, his intellect, his independence, placed him far outside the sphere of control that Henry VIII demanded from his subjects. When Henry sought to dissolve his long marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Fisher stood firmly, openly, and courageously on the Queen's side. He insisted that the marriage was valid under the authority of the Pope, and he refused to bend to the king's will. That alone made him a threat, but it was more than simple disagreement. Fisher represented the old order, the spiritual authority of Rome, and the belief that the king could not decide matters of doctrine or marriage according to personal desire. For Henry, Fisher was a political headache. For Anne Boleyn, Fisher was a direct obstacle to her future crown. Henry wanted freedom. Anne wanted legitimacy. But Fisher, loyal to Catherine, loyal to Rome, stood immovable between them. And then, as if perfectly timed, a poisoning took place within Fisher's own household. It happened on the 18th day of February, in the year 1531, at precisely the moment when Fisher's influence was most inconvenient for the king. 2 people died. 17 others fell ill. Fisher alone remained untouched. The implications were explosive. Though Fisher survived physically, his reputation was suddenly at risk. The bishop who had fed and supported the poor now seemed connected, however unintentionally, to a deadly meal. Some of the victims had been those very same poor who had trusted him. In a period when public opinion could be weaponized, this event threatened to tarnish Fisher in the eyes of the kingdom. And Henry, always eager to weaken those who opposed him, could use that stain to his political advantage. But there was another possibility, darker and more unsettling than the first. What if Fisher truly was the intended target, and Richard Roose was merely a pawn? During the Tudor era, poison was rarely a matter of personal revenge. It was a political tool, silent, efficient, and difficult to trace. Those who stood in the way of royal ambition often found themselves entangled in plots they never saw coming. Fisher, who defied Henry openly, who supported Catherine boldly, who rejected the rising influence of Anne Boleyn, was exactly the kind of man enemies might wish to eliminate. Roose never revealed any accomplices. He never named a mastermind. He never gave a motive beyond the claim of a foolish prank. The silence could mean he knew nothing, or it could mean he was never given the chance to speak. In the Tower, under torture, under threat of a uniquely horrific death, a man's voice could be muted long before he met the cauldron, and fate added one final stroke of irony to the entire affair. John Fisher himself was executed by Henry VIII, only a few years later, not by poison, not by accident, but by the blade, because he refused to acknowledge Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. Fisher died with dignity, a martyr in the eyes of Rome, eventually declared a saint centuries later. He held firm to his beliefs until the moment the axe fell at Tower Hill. Richard Roose, the humble cook who served him, met a very different end. No honour, no last speech, no trial, no defence. Only fire, boiling water, and a death so brutal that even Tudor chroniclers wrote of it with unease. In the end, both men were destroyed by the same king. Both were caught in the storm created by Henry's desire for power, for freedom, for Anne Boleyn. But history remembers them in vastly different ways. Fisher, the scholar bishop, as a martyr. Roose, the cook, as a man boiled alive, his truth lost in steam and screams. The accusation against Richard Roose did not merely disturb the quiet order of one household, it sent a wave of panic rolling through all of London, a fear that seeped into every noble dining hall and every kitchen hearth. Poisoning, in the Tudor world, was a terror that lurked beneath the surface of daily life. Food spoiled easily, hygiene was poor, and sickness was common. Yet when a bishop, a man of Fisher's stature, was believed to have been the intended victim of poison, people no longer saw random misfortune or rotten meat. They saw political conspiracy. In a kingdom already strained by religious tension, by Henry VIII's marital crisis, and by whispers of reform, the idea of poisoning a high-ranking churchman felt like the spark that could ignite civil unrest. It did not take long before fear roared through London like fire through dry thatch. The ripple effects appeared almost immediately. Noble families hired personal food tasters, servants whose sole purpose was to try every dish before their masters dared touch it. Kitchen workers found themselves inspected, monitored, and interrogated in ways they had never experienced before. A misplaced spice or a sour smell could trigger suspicion. Rumours thickened and hardened into truths in the minds of ordinary citizens, who repeated every exaggerated version until no one knew where facts stopped and fear began. Meals at court once grand, noisy displays of wealth and comfort became cautious, tense performances. Trenchers and goblets were no longer symbols of hospitality, but potential weapons. No one trusted anyone. Even Henry VIII, a man accustomed to absolute command, began to doubt the loyalty of those who cooked his meals or poured his wine. The royal court shifted overnight from its usual paranoia about heresy to a new, sharper fear: poison. Every servant who entered the king's chambers did so under eyes sharpened by suspicion. Every dish laid before him was inspected with trembling care. This growing panic placed crushing pressure on the lower servants, those without power, without reputation, without the means to defend themselves. A single accusation could destroy them. A single rumour could lead to the rack, or worse. In this world, Richard Roose's fate became a symbol of what could happen to any cook, any servant, anyone near food. And Henry knew exactly how to use that fear. By executing Roose in the most horrific way imaginable, Henry achieved two goals at once. He eliminated a man officially declared guilty, and delivered a public warning so vivid that no one could mistake its meaning. Whoever dares poison, or makes me suspect they might, will die screaming. Thus, within mere weeks, London felt smothered by a heavy fog of dread. Conversations in taverns dropped to whispers whenever Roose's name surfaced. Some claimed he was a criminal mastermind, determined to murder the bishop. Others murmured he was merely a scapegoat, a pawn sacrificed to conceal the ambitions of powerful figures. But no matter which version people believed, they all agreed on one unforgettable detail: he was boiled alive. The method of death overshadowed everything else. It drowned the city in fascination and terror. Mothers told their children about the dangers of wrongdoing using Roose as the cautionary tale. Servants told each other to stay quiet, keep their heads down, and avoid anything that might bring suspicion. Even the wealthy, accustomed to feeling safe behind their estates, felt vulnerable at their own dinner tables. In a time already riddled with instability, religious upheaval, political carving, battles for royal favour, Roose's execution became a weapon sharper than any sword. Henry wielded it to solidify his power, to cow the aristocracy, and to remind every subject that the king controlled more than armies and laws. He controlled life and death. He could erase a man without trial, reshape the law in a moment, invent a new form of execution to send a message no one would forget. The case of Richard Roose did not just end the life of a low-born cook. It changed the way England understood food, kitchens, servants, and survival. He eliminated a man officially declared guilty and delivered a public warning so vivid that no one could mistake its meaning. Whoever dares poison, or makes me suspect they might, will die screaming. Thus, within mere weeks, London felt smothered by a heavy fog of dread. Conversations in taverns dropped to whispers whenever Roose's name surfaced. Some claimed he was a criminal mastermind, determined to murder the bishop. The execution of Richard Roose stands among the most brutal spectacles ever witnessed at Smithfield, an execution ground already steeped in blood, where flames had consumed heretics and ropes had snapped the breath from countless thieves. Yet even in a place accustomed to horror, nothing prepared London for what unfolded on the 5th day of April in the year 1531. This was not a hanging, nor a burning, nor even a beheading. It was something far darker, a macabre performance, a chilling display in which a human being was treated like an object to be plunged into boiling water. At the centre of the square sat a massive iron cauldron, large enough to hold a grown man. It was positioned high on a sturdy frame, so that even those pressed at the edge of the crowd could see it clearly. Beneath it, flames roared, licking the iron, sending up waves of smoke and steam that wrapped around Smithfield like a fog from the underworld. The water inside tossed and rolled, bubbling furiously as if hungry for the life it was about to claim. Crowds jammed every corner of the square. Men climbed onto barrels and wooden carts. Boys scrambled up walls. Some daring souls even perched on rooftops, craning their necks for a better view. A strange hush settled over Smithfield as executioners brought forward Richard Roose, bound in iron chains and strapped into a metal frame shaped like a cage. His arms could not move, his legs hung suspended. He was entirely at the mercy of those who controlled the chain pulleys above. When Roose was lifted over the cauldron, the heat rising from the churning surface made him cry out before he ever touched the water. Witnesses later said the mere breath of that boiling liquid was enough to scald the skin. But this was only the beginning. After a moment suspended in the haze of steam, the frame was lowered. The first immersion drew screams so piercing that people swore they echoed through Cloth Fair and into the surrounding lanes. He was held there long enough for the crowd to see the water explode into froth. When he was pulled back up, he writhed, shaking violently within the iron bars. His agony hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing upon the chest of every witness. The executioners waited until his screams thinned into frantic gasps. Then they lowered him again. The second immersion seemed to stretch into eternity. The sound of boiling water rolling over metal mingled with the roars of pain. Some people turned away, unable to watch. Others stared with a horrifying stillness, numbed by years of Tudor cruelty. Pregnant women fainted. Children screamed. Grown men trembled. And then came the third descent, the final act of this dreadful performance. No one knew if Roose was conscious. No one knew whether he felt that last plunge or whether his mind had fled somewhere beyond the reach of pain. But when his body was pulled up for the last time, he no longer moved. The roaring of the cauldron drowned out everything except the knowledge that a life had ended in the most agonizing way the Tudor age could conceive. Each raising of the iron frame felt like a grim display staged for the crowd. Each scream became a testament to the absolute power of Henry VIII, a reminder that the king could extinguish life in whatever fashion suited him. For some spectators, the horror was overwhelming. They carried the memory for weeks, unable to sleep, unable to eat without imagining the boiling water. But for others hardened by years of violent entertainment, this spectacle was just another grisly show. When it was over, the bubbling of the cauldron slowly quieted, and the heavy steam drifted upward, dimming the morning Sunday. Richard Roose's body was eventually removed, but the memory of his suffering clung to Smithfield like soot on stone. In that moment, Smithfield, already a place darkened by executions, sank deeper into infamy. The boiling of Richard Roose was recorded not only as a death, but as one of the most savage punishments ever carried out in England. And long after the flames died and the water cooled, the story of that terrible morning continued to haunt the nation, whispered as a warning about the cruelty a king could unleash when driven by fear, anger, or political need. The most chilling truth in the entire story of Richard Roose does not lie in the boiling cauldron, nor in the screams that echoed across Smithfield. It lies in something far more unsettling, something quiet, deliberate, and entirely crafted by human hands. Henry VIII invented an entire law simply to kill Roose in the manner he desired. Before this moment, England had no such punishment as boiling alive. Poisoners had been hanged, sometimes burned, occasionally drawn and quartered if their crime touched on treason. But never had a man been sentenced to die like food dropped into a pot. Yet within days of Roose's arrest, Henry acted with startling speed and precision. He introduced a new act, rushed through Parliament with almost unnatural efficiency. Every murder committed by poison would be classified as treason, and the punishment for such treason would be execution by boiling alive. This new law was passed on the 28th day of February, in the year 1531, not even 2 weeks after the poisoning at Bishop Fisher's house on the 18th of February. The timing was so perfect, so surgically precise, that many contemporaries believed Henry had already decided Richard Roose's fate long before any investigation began. Henry's habit of bending, twisting, or outright rewriting the law to destroy his enemies was well known. Dozens would eventually fall under charges of treason, for reasons that ranged from political defiance to merely speaking against the king's wishes. But Roose's case was more extreme than most. Here, Henry did not simply manipulate existing laws, he created a punishment that had never existed in English legal history. Why boiling? Why a death so grotesque that even hardened Tudor chroniclers wrote about it with discomfort? Those who lived at the time offered explanations that ranged from symbolic to strategic. One theory focused on symbolism, grim and theatrical. Roose was a cook, a man who worked with pots and flames. He was accused of poisoning food, therefore he would be cooked, boiled like the soup he had corrupted. In the Tudor world, justice was often wrapped in layers of performance. A traitor might be dragged to his death to demonstrate the journey of betrayal, a heretic burned to show his soul consumed by false doctrine. And now, a cook accused of poisoning was transformed into a grotesque culinary metaphor. But there was another theory, colder, darker, and more political. Some believed Henry feared that a public trial would allow Roose to speak freely. Under oath, under examination, Roose might reveal a detail truthful or not that implicated powerful figures in court. He might hint at Protestant conspirators, or Catholic loyalists, or even factions around Anne Boleyn. And in a climate where the wrong accusation could ignite chaos, Henry preferred silence. The simplest way to ensure silence was terrifyingly effective. No trial, no defense, no witnesses, no chance for Roose to speak even a single name. By redefining poisoning as treason and dictating boiling alive as its punishment, Henry turned Roose into a man condemned not by evidence, but by royal desire. And so, with the stroke of a quill, a new form of execution was born. An execution meant not merely to kill, but to stun, to terrify, to send a message that could not be misunderstood. Richard Roose became the first, almost the only victim of boiling under Tudor law. There would be very few others. Even Henry himself did not use the punishment often. It was too shocking, too extreme, too foreign, even for a brutal era. But for this one moment, this single case, Henry wielded it without hesitation. Roose's death was not merely the tragedy of one cook. It revealed a kingdom where law bent like a reed in the hands of a king, where justice could be redrawn overnight, where the lives of ordinary men were erased to preserve political convenience. In the boiling of Richard Roose, England witnessed not just an execution, but the frightening reach of absolute power, a reminder that under Henry VIII, even the laws of the realm could be reshaped as easily as metal softening in fire. After the horrifying death of Richard Roose, London sank into a swirl of conflicting emotions: shock, revulsion, curiosity, and a deep, lingering fear. For many citizens, it was the first time in their lives they had witnessed a human being executed in a manner indistinguishable from torture. The brutality of the event sent a tremor through Tudor society, leaving scars not only on the streets of Smithfield, but on the minds of all who saw or even heard about what had happened. Those present spoke later of sleepless nights, of dreams haunted by boiling water and screams. One witness described Roose's cries as tearing through the London sky, a phrase that captures how the sound seemed to haunt the very air of the city. Pregnant women collapsed from shock. Children sobbed uncontrollably. Grown men found themselves trembling despite their efforts to remain stoic. Some tried to hide their distress, but their eyes told another story, one of disbelief and horror. Yet what disturbed observers most was not the brutality itself, but the unsettling truth that not everyone was horrified. A portion of the Tudor population, so accustomed to violence, viewed Roose's execution almost like a public entertainment. These were people who had grown bored of hangings at Tyburn, of beheadings on Tower Hill, of bodies twisting in the flame at Smithfield stake. But boiling alive, that was new. That was sensational. That was something to talk about. For many citizens, it was the first time in their lives they had witnessed a human being executed in a manner indistinguishable from torture. The brutality of the event sent a tremor through Tudor society, leaving scars not only on the streets of Smithfield, but on the minds of all who saw or even heard about what had happened. Those present spoke later of sleepless nights, of dreams haunted by boiling water and screams. A chilling reminder of how easily a powerless man, someone from the very bottom of society, could be crushed beneath the royal seal. This realization settled uncomfortably into the minds of the people. If a cook could be boiled alive without a trial, then who was truly safe? If the king could invent punishments as he pleased, what protection did the law offer? The Tudor world, already perilous, became stifling after Roose's death. Words were weighed carefully, jokes were whispered, trust evaporated in kitchens, in noble houses, and even in the royal court. Rumours multiplied, like smoke curling from a dying fire. Some believed Roose was genuinely guilty, others insisted he was framed, and a growing number whispered that the entire event had been orchestrated to tarnish Bishop Fisher or to silence Roose before he could reveal something dangerous. But no matter which version people believed, they all agreed on one unshakable truth. Richard Roose was killed in a way no human being deserved. And with that single act, Smithfield transformed. It was no longer just an execution ground. It became a symbol, a place that embodied the coldest, darkest edge of Henry's power. A place that reminded every Londoner that kings could be cruel beyond comprehension, and that justice, under the wrong ruler, could bend into something monstrous. From that day forward, whenever the name Smithfield was spoken, it carried with it the echo of boiling water, the smell of steam, and the memory of a man whose death became one of the most terrifying episodes in England's long and violent history. Although the reign of Henry VIII saw countless executions from noblemen to merchants, from rebels to queens, the case of Richard Roose lingers in historical memory with an unusual, almost haunting persistence. Many died under Henry's rule, but very few deaths carved themselves into England's conscience the way Roose's did. And the reason lies not only in the brutality of the punishment, but in its uniqueness, injustice, and symbolic weight. First, Roose was one of the extremely rare individuals in all of English history to be executed by boiling alive. This was not a standard punishment. It was not a customary method like hanging or beheading. It was not efficient, nor was it designed for a swift end. Instead, it was a punishment engineered to inflict prolonged suffering, to turn the act of execution into a drawn-out public torment. Most Tudor executions, though gruesome by modern standards, still followed some form of established protocol. Roose's did not. His death unfolded like a ritual of cruelty, difficult for even seasoned spectators to stomach. Second, the case stands as a stark reflection of Henry's absolute and terrifying authority. Roose died not because evidence condemned him, not because a jury weighed facts, but because the king willed it. The entire legal process collapsed into a single voice, Henry's, and that voice was enough to invent a new category of treason, create a new method of execution, and carry it out within weeks. Roose never had the chance to defend himself. Not a single word from him was allowed to shape his fate. In the Tudor world, where the king could be judge, jury, and executioner, Roose became a chilling reminder of how fragile justice could be. Third, the case exposes the deep vulnerability of ordinary people in Tudor England. It did not matter whether one was a cook, or a scholar, a servant, or a noble. Anyone caught in the wrong place, at the wrong moment, or entangled, however, accidentally in the snarled threads of Tudor politics, could be destroyed without warning. The world Henry created was a world where suspicion was a weapon, where timing was fatal, where innocence offered no protection, and where a single whisper could lead a man to the scaffold, or in Roose's case, the cauldron. Fourth, the later fate of Bishop John Fisher casts a long, unsettling shadow over the entire affair. Fisher, the man many believed to be the true intended target of the alleged poisoning, was himself executed by Henry a few years later for refusing to recognize the king as supreme head of the Church of England. Fisher died a martyr, praised for his integrity, canonized centuries later. But the fact that he too was eventually killed by Henry raises troubling questions. If Fisher was Henry's political enemy, if his silence or removal served the king's ambitions, then Roose's death becomes even murkier. Was he truly guilty? Or was he a convenient sacrifice, someone to blame, someone to eliminate, someone whose execution prevented more dangerous truths from surfacing? Finally, the story of Richard Roose endures because it reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, queens, or great military victories. Sometimes, history is illuminated through the suffering of those whose names would otherwise have been lost. Roose was not a statesman, nor a warrior, nor a man of influence. He was a cook, someone whose life might never have entered the record, if not for the horrifying manner in which it was taken. And yet, through his death, he became an unwilling symbol, a symbol of pain endured by the powerless, a symbol of injustice committed in the name of royal authority, a symbol of a time when human lives could be reshaped or destroyed by a king's fleeting suspicion. Richard Roose, though a simple cook, was thrust into the very heart of Tudor darkness. His death still echoes through the centuries, not because of who he was in life, but because of what was done to him, and what that act reveals about power, cruelty, and the terrifying fragility of ordinary people in the shadow of Henry VIII's throne. When people look back on the reign of Henry VIII, three images rise immediately to the surface of history. 6 wives, each carrying her own tragedy, a kingdom torn from the Catholic Church, and tens of thousands of brutal executions, scattered like scars across the Tudor landscape. Within this grim legacy, the case of Richard Roose sits quietly small in scale, yet sharp, like a splinter lodged in the memory of England. It reminds later generations that wherever absolute power exists, absolute brutality waits just beneath its surface. Roose's death was not the largest injustice of Henry's reign, nor the most politically significant, but it was one of the most revealing. For the truth is simple and unsettling. Henry did not need to kill Richard Roose to maintain his authority. His throne was not threatened by a cook. His kingdom would not have shaken had Roose been pardoned, or even merely imprisoned. But Henry chose to kill him, and chose a method so horrifying that it echoed across the entire realm because he wished to affirm a single, chilling principle. No one may threaten the order I establish. Whether Roose truly committed poisoning or not, ultimately did not matter. Henry transformed the man's death into a nationwide warning, a lesson carved into the kingdom with boiling water and human screams. His decision reflected a philosophy of rule rooted in fear, instill terror to ensure loyalty, demonstrate that the king can reshape law at will, turn a nameless servant into a lesson for millions. Roose's execution, then, was not merely punishment, it was theatrical governance, political messaging delivered through pain. And what it revealed most clearly was not Henry's strength, but the fragility of English law under his hand. A single proclamation could make or unmake statutes. A single suspicion could condemn a man. A single royal whim could bend justice until it snapped. Looking back at the case today, several truths emerge: quiet, steady, undeniable. Justice does not survive on its own. It must be guarded, especially from those powerful enough to twist it. Unrestrained authority breeds tragedy, even when wrapped in the language of order and loyalty. Truth can be buried under fear, under politics, under the silence of those too frightened to speak. And perhaps the deepest, most human lesson of all, it is always the smallest, most powerless people who pay the highest price for battles they never chose. Richard Roose never sought to stand between king and queen, between bishop and court, between Rome and England. He never set out to be a political figure, a religious pawn, or a symbol of anything. He was a cook, a man who stirred pots, baked bread, and prepared simple meals. But the world around him was too large, the ambitions too fierce, the suspicions too heavy. When the machinery of Tudor power began to turn, it crushed him with the same indifference as a wheel rolling over a stone. And so, on that bleak morning in Smithfield, as the cauldron boiled and the crowd gathered, Richard Roose, an ordinary man, was consumed by a struggle far beyond his understanding. His life ended not because of what he was, but because of where he happened to stand in a kingdom ruled by fear. He was swallowed by the era, just as the boiling water swallowed him. When the steam from the great cauldron finally thinned and drifted into the cold London air, and when the crowd gradually scattered from Smithfield, some trembling, some silent, some oddly excited, the story of Richard Roose slipped quietly into history in a way he himself could never have imagined. He had not been a hero, nor a rebel, nor a political visionary. He was not a name destined for chronicles or royal records. He had simply been a cook, a man tending pots and preparing meals. And yet his death would carry a weight far heavier than anything his humble station suggested. What makes the case of Roose so haunting is not only the grotesque spectacle of boiling alive, but the cavern of unanswered questions that yawns beneath it. No one truly knows what happened in Bishop John Fisher's kitchen that February day. No one knows whether Roose intended to cause harm or whether he acted in foolish jest. No one knows whether he acted alone or under pressure, whether he was manipulated, or whether he was simply in the wrong place at the worst possible time. And the most disturbing truth is this: no one in power cared enough to find out. The truth mattered less than the king's narrative, less than order, less than control. A traitor might be dragged to his death to demonstrate the journey of betrayal. A heretic burned to show his soul consumed by false doctrine. And now, a cook accused of poisoning was transformed into a grotesque culinary metaphor. But there was another theory, colder, darker, and more political. Some believed Henry feared that a public trial would allow Roose to speak freely. Under oath, under examination, Roose might reveal a detail, truthful or not, that implicated powerful figures in court. Anne Boleyn, the woman rumoured to resent Fisher, would be beheaded on Tower Green in the year 1536. Henry's wives would fall, his ministers would fall, his closest friends would fall. Laws would be rewritten, oaths reshaped, accusations hurled like weapons. The religious identity of an entire nation would be overturned. And through all these changes, one thing remained constant. Ordinary people like Richard Roose were crushed beneath the wheels of Tudor power. He was not a threat. He was not a figure of influence. He was not someone whose life altered the course of kingdoms. Instead, he was precisely the kind of man who suffered most during times of political turmoil. Powerless, voiceless, expendable. Yet his story endures, not because he shaped history, but because history shaped him in one of the cruelest ways imaginable. Roose became a symbol not of rebellion, but of injustice. A reminder that in certain eras, human beings could be boiled alive not because of guilt, but because a king declared it so. His death forces us to confront the darkest aspects of absolute power, where a single royal decree could extinguish a life and bend the law to justify it. When we retell his story, we are not merely recounting an episode of Henry's brutality. We are giving voice to someone who never had the chance to speak for himself. We are acknowledging the thousands whose names were lost, whose stories were silenced, whose fates were sealed by forces they could neither understand nor resist. And in the softest moment at the end of this long, grim tale, when the noise of execution fades, when the crowd dissolves, when even Henry's anger becomes a distant echo, we are left with one quiet, etching question: did Richard Roose truly deserve to die that way? No chronicle gives an answer. No witness can say for certain. The truth was swallowed long ago by fear, by politics, by royal will. Perhaps that is why his story has become timeless. Because some questions linger precisely because they can never be solved.